All right, y'all. I have the pleasure of introducing our two interviews today, and they are amazing. Um, I'll start with Attorney Jaustin Ohuery. He is the husband of Dr. Chelsea West Ohuery, who y'all got to see last week. The amazing Dr. Chelsea West. Love her so much. They have two beautiful girls together, as we talked about last week. He is from Austin, Texas, born and raised. I think it's only two of us on the line right now, me and him, like born and raised in Austin. Even we've never met, but still. Oh, sorry, Ada.
Hey.
And Eric, okay, it's a few of us. It's a few unicorns in the room. Austin, Texas, born and raised. I apologize. Attorney Jaustin is an assistant district attorney for Travis County. He is a prosecuting attorney, which is one among many perspectives that he'll be able to bring to the table today. His Bachelor of Arts is in economics, and that's from the University of Florida. And his Juris Doctorate, or his JD, is from Georgetown University Law Center. Attorney Jaustin is the commissioner on the Austin Ethics Review Commission. And Jaustin and Chelsea are community group leaders at Mosaic, and they lead in many other capacities as well. So please help me welcome Attorney Jaustin.
Hey.
Yes. We have one more guest today. Y'all have a very special treat today, and I'm so glad we're recording this because some people don't get to see it. They're not here, but this is a special moment because we also have Judge Stephen Vigorito. He grew up in Louisiana and attended college at LSU, majoring in political science. He received Christ in his senior year in college and moved to Austin after college. He went to law school at the University of Texas School of Law and graduated in 1997. Stephen practiced criminal defense for about 10 years. During this time, he also served in leadership at a state agency and as a legislative director for a state representative. In 2010, Stephen was appointed as a judge for Austin Municipal Court and has served in that capacity since. Judge Steve, his primary role is serving as a magistrate at Travis County Central Booking, dealing with people arrested for criminal offenses and issuing search and arrest warrants involving cases under investigation. Judge Steve joined Mosaic in 2011 and serves primarily as a deacon and as a teacher in classes and small groups. He is married to the beautiful Miss Renee Vigorito, and they have their first child on the way to be born soon, and I am publicly volunteering to babysit. So thank y'all so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you today.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Roslyn, you need to teach a grow class on how to host a Zoom grow class. What you need to do. Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So obviously this week, the topic being justice and reconciliation. And so we figured it might be a great idea to get two people who are working in our justice system, who also love Jesus, who walk with him in a deep, intimate relationship, to not only speak from our kind of legal system in our nation's side of justice and reconciliation, but also merge that into a biblical understanding of what justice and reconciliation looks like. So, Jaustin, Judge Steve, we appreciate you joining us here today. Again, as a reminder, if you'll put your window on speaker view, that way whoever's talking will be highlighted on your window. Go ahead and mute your mic so you don't unnecessarily get highlighted on somebody else's window. We're going to go through our questions here. I've got a timer that I set for myself today because I realized last week I went twice as long as I was supposed to on the interview. So I'm going to keep to my timer. We may end up going a few minutes over just because sometimes I just can't help it when the content is this good. And then we'll get into our breakout groups. So to kick things off, I'm going to ask a couple of questions here of our guests. So Jaustin and Steve, if y'all wouldn't mind, and maybe Jaustin, we'll let you go first here. Give us a little bit of background about yourself, kind of where'd you grow up? What was your neighborhood like? How many siblings you have? What was your family experience like? And of course, Jaustin's sister is on here with us, so she can correct any error comments that are made about growing up. So Jaustin, go ahead and introduce yourself to us. Let us know a little bit about your background.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I think Dr. Smith did an amazing job just giving, some of the professional background, but a little bit about me more personally. I did grow up here in Austin. My parents were married, divorced, and then remarried a little bit. And so that, of course, shapes my perspective on family and the significance of family and how that impacts things. But I also, grew up financially struggling. There were periods where we lived in government housing, relied on food stamps. I went to a private school that catered to a lot of extremely wealthy people, and I was not in that category whatsoever. So I think that shaped my worldview and perspective, and just seeing some of those disparities, but also seeing the opportunity that financial success can bring, and how it actually, how it can change a person's life. And so that's a little bit about me. I think being a Black man, but also being someone without money, shaped my desire to improve my own life. But in terms of law, it was always Matlock and his clever questioning that kind of pushed me into law. And then also my grandfather was a preacher and pastor for so many years. I think just the ability to have an impact on people's lives through oratory skills is what pushed me into the field of law.
So there's little 10-year-old Jaustin Ohuery watching Andy Griffin on Matlock, huh?
Pretty much, yeah, with my mom, yeah.
That's awesome. I got to ask, man, like, divorce, remarriage, one, that's a beautiful story. Number two, I know, is it just you and Ada? Do y'all have any other siblings?
Yeah, I should have said that. No, so I am the oldest of three, so it's me. I have a younger brother, Jonathan. He's about a year and a half younger than me, and then of course my youngest and only sister, Ada.
Way to go, Ada. So I'm curious, as a kid who grew up in a broken home myself. My dad walked out on us when I was 3. What was that experience like, watching your parents divorce and having to walk through that, and then seeing them reconcile and get back together? And you said that really shaped you in a way. How did that shape you?
Well, I think it forced me to be a pragmatist, honestly. I think that, between the siblings, because I was the oldest, we all took it a little bit differently, but I could see the benefits of both sides, honestly. I think it forced me to have a lot of compassion on everyone. I certainly have compassion on single mothers, and realizing how difficult it is to raise children. Also understanding that there's a sense of stability that comes from a 2-parent household, but also just acknowledging that, sometimes people go through difficult situations, and people have to really make reasonable assessments about what's in the best interest of themselves and also their families. So I think it forced me to realize that in any relationship, you just have to be a wise person. You kind of have to make decisions of compromise and sacrifice, and put another person first. And those can really be difficult decisions. But I think it shaped me to view life in a measured perspective, never just jump to anyone's side, but view things in a measured perspective and really focus on what is the overall outcome.
So it really kind of helped shape that lawyer mindset that you've kind of developed over the years.
Pretty much.
Tell me a little bit about the school that you got into. How did you get into that private school? And was it something like for what, the gifted students? Was it a lottery system? How did you find your way into that school, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, for sure. So, a lot of that credit goes to my mom. She always put an emphasis on all of her children being in the best schools that they could be in. And I think it's because she saw that there was real opportunity there, and was playing the long game. And so for a lot of times, I was just a transfer student to different schools. And eventually I was a transfer student to Barton Hills, and a principal by the name of Dottie Raymer. Her son went to St. Stephen's, and so she recommended St. Stephen's, and then from there, essentially got a scholarship to attend the school. As a child, and even as an adult, the thing I love most about it is that the school is near, I think, 360 or near Westlake. Just the aesthetic appeal of that side of town. And I think it also gave me, and I think this is something I cherish, it gave me an horizon that other people don't necessarily have. Before going to the school, I think there's a show called Boy Meets World, and there was this guy on there who was a geek, and he wore like pencil pocket protectors, and I figured everyone that went to the school was going to be that way. There was a culture shock. That was not true. That that is not how everyone was, but it did show me that I can have something to dream for. I can have something to push for. So I was able to see that from a young age.
What was your experience at the school like? Was there, I mean, obviously probably one of the few minority students in the school. Was there some prejudice, some racial tensions? Like, what was your experience there?
For sure. And I think, as an adult, when I look back, I have to realize that I was dealing with adolescents, right? I'm dealing with people age 12 to age 18. I think it was a little bit of race ignorance as well as their own financial situation. One, for example, didn't have a lot of money. Fortunately, the school had a program where they would give me $1 or $2 to buy things when we called the canteen, but really was just a place for people to buy food, like little snacks here and there, Hot Pockets, etc. And, I will always be indebted to a friend I had there. He was another Black male there, but I think his family was doing a little bit better than mine. Treated me like a little brother, right? If I ever needed $1, he was there. And I think that just reminds me, hey, you have to have compassion on people's lives, especially if you get to a position where you can have compassion. But also, with some of the kids that had a whole lot more money, there was this expectation that you were just going to be able to attain everything, right? Why don't you have a car when you're 16? Why don't you live in a house that's close to where we are? We don't have to consider other people's differences. Like, for example, there was a Chinese photo, a painting that we were looking at, and someone used some slur to refer to the painting and didn't even reference it to the right country. So examples like that, for me, honestly, caused me, when I went to college, to kind of live in a cocoon. And I'll be frank with this, in a cocoon away from white people, because I felt that it wasn't really worth the energy and the effort to try to convince people to take a value in things that my family value or that my community value. And you could kind of see a closed-mindedness to considering other perspectives and viewpoints that really weren't white. And so I was fortunate because my high school graduating class was 96 people, right? And it wasn't a big school anyway. Right. And so when I University of Florida for college, the entire campus has 50,000 people. A significant portion of those are African American, so I could really immerse myself in African American programs. I could be part of the Black Student Union, could be part of like a Black Brotherhood while I was there. I could just insulate myself essentially in Black culture. Now, as an adult, obviously, you interact, and I think the call of Christ calls us to interact and engage with people in a meaningful way outside of our race. But I think what my experience leaving high school was, good intentions or not, some people can live in a bubble where they really just don't have to be concerned with the narratives of other people. Like, I'm so wealthy, I genuinely don't have to interact with poor people in a meaningful way. I genuinely don't have to know about the struggles that face either people without money or people of a different race, because that's just not my life.
Yeah. Did you say University of Florida?
That's right. Come on, SEC. That's real football there.
Hey, I appreciate the SEC. But
yeah,
we're gunning for a showdown, man. It's gonna be Bulldogs and Gators for the SEC East, so we'll have to trash as we get closer to that. Well, appreciate you sharing, Jaustin. We're going to go over to Judge Steve now. Judge Steve, would you give us a little bit of background? You're growing up. I know you're a Raging Cajun from Louisiana, LSU grad. We got the SEC connection going here today, so SEC football. But Steve, give us some background on where you grew up. What was your neighborhood like? Siblings, family. Give us a better understanding of kind of what your experience growing up was.
Yeah, I grew up in Louisiana. Middle class neighborhood, not high class. We weren't affluent. My dad was a philosophy professor at a university, and in the liberal arts professors, they didn't necessarily get paid much like the software technology professors. So we actually, but we had a nice life. I mean, compared to some of the things that Justin is describing, I mean, we lived on a dead end street with about 12 houses on it, and everyone knew each other. We didn't lock our doors at night. And so, you know, I had a pleasant childhood in that respect. Now, I would say that my mom was an alcoholic, and so we had a lot of internal family dysfunctions. And my dad was oftentimes heavily distracted with dealing with those issues with my mom. And so there was a degree to which I was neglected, and I was kind of left to myself to figure life out. But when it came to things like fearing for my safety or wondering whether I was going to have food to eat at night, I didn't have to deal with those types of struggles at all. So I had one brother, an older brother, and he was a good influence on my life. We fought a lot when I was a kid, but later on in college, he led me to Christ, and we became much better friends then. I went to a private school just like Justin. It was a Catholic private school in Lafayette, Louisiana, and that's where all the rich kids went. And my dad had just decided he was going to make the sacrifice financially to get me in there. So as a result, I was profoundly aware of the fact that everyone else in the school was much wealthier than I was. And so I didn't deal with poverty, but I definitely dealt with an inferiority complex of just kind of feeling like being aware. And I can identify with what Justin said about, you know, certain people got their new cars when they were 16. I didn't get a car like that. I didn't get a car till after I was finished college, you know. And so I did develop a kind of an inferiority complex of being aware that I wasn't part of the in crowd the way I defined it within the white community. Yeah. And that was a struggle for me, and it caused me, I'll be honest, to be a pretty self-centered guy my goal was to strive to get into the group that I knew I wasn't really a part of. And that I wasn't a person who was concerned about justice at all. I stopped believing in God. I stopped believing in God altogether when I was like 13. Okay. And I was just pretty self-centered rascal. And I went to LSU, joined a fraternity, you know, so had that kind of entitled insular life, you know. I would say that I got exposed to a certain level of racism in fraternity life that I had not been experienced before. And what I mean by that is that, so a lot of my fraternity brothers were from New Orleans, and the white experience coming out of New Orleans, that they came out with a much more vicious type of explicit racism that actually shocked me. So there were differences in my upbringing to that kind of experience. Matter of fact, I was at LSU at the time when David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the KKK, was running for governor in Louisiana. Yeah. And so, you know, that's the social context in which I grew up. And I received Christ my summer before my senior year in college, and that changed everything. I was a pretty self-centered rascal, and God changed that a lot. And when I moved to Austin, I joined the church my brother was going to. I moved to Austin because I didn't have any Christian friends but him, and so I was trying to make a change, and I moved to Austin. I joined almost all African-American church with African-American pastor and African-American leadership, and that's where I was for 18 years. And that formed me in terms of my Christianity. It exposed me to a certain way of looking at faith. Talking about issues of justice was something that was common from the pulpit. I was part of that church during a time when O.J. Simpson was on trial in the early 90s, and Rodney King went down, and the Million Man March, and Louis Farrakhan, Nation of Islam is on college campuses. So it was a pretty transitional time in some ways. And so kind of growing up in my faith in the context of the African-American experience was very formative of hearing and learning of how to look at things from that lens. And so in terms of law, 3 years after I became a Christian, I felt like God was pushing me in that area. And I would say that if I had become a lawyer without Christ, I would have been the worst human being anybody could have ever met, because I was so self-centered and personally ambitious. But Christ changed that around, and I felt like he wanted me to devote my law career to him. And so I did, and just trusted God that he would use me to do what he wanted me to do. Kind of a synopsis. Hope that wasn't too long.
No, that's great. That's great. Let me go back and ask you just briefly, about going to that private school, and that you said there was an inferiority complex in you. Were you ever treated differently by other students because of your socioeconomic status?
I wouldn't say explicitly. I didn't have people telling me, "You broke fool, what's wrong with you?" It was nothing like that. It was more of a thing where I lived in a different part of town than all the rich people did. It wasn't a poverty-stricken town or anything like that, or a portion of town. But we didn't live in a big house. All of my friends got cars when they were 16 or 17 years old. I didn't have a car. My dad dropped me off at school if I didn't take the bus, and so it was more of kind of a self-conscious awareness, that I just, I didn't look forward to bringing my friends to my house, because I knew they were way more affluent than I would, and they see my house and just kind of humble, that kind of thing. So it was more of an internal thing, kind of that self-talk where you feel like you don't belong.
Gotcha.
That makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for that. So let's get into a little bit more of the issues of justice and reconciliation. Appreciate y'all's backstories, and obviously, when Dr. Smith and I were putting together our guest list on here, we prayed about it and felt like this is what the Holy Spirit led us to do, is to have you two on for this week. Hearing y'all's stories, once again, the Holy Spirit seems to know what he's doing. So I appreciate y'all being here. Y'all are really kind of custom fit for the questions that we want to ask here. So Jaustin, let me go to you and just ask you this, man. Each day, like, you're face to face, you're right in the thick of justice, like working for the DA's office, court cases, all that stuff that's going on. Let me ask you, from your involvement and what your office does, how do y'all go about determining, in regards to justice, whether someone is a victim or a victimizer? How do y'all delineate between? How do you discern those differences?
So I'll address that twofold, more generally speaking, and then more specifically speaking. I'll start with more specifically speaking, just kind of with the unit that I'm currently part of. I am part of the family violence. So what that means is whenever there's a family incident of assault, I would handle the prosecution of that case, and more often than not, we're speaking of instances where men are abusing women. And because I'm dealing with felonies, most of the people are subject to going to prison with any of the convictions. A lot of times that doesn't happen. There is probation, but when looking at whether a person is a victim or not, what makes those cases particularly difficult and challenging is that you have women that are captured to the individual abuses and coercion of a particular man. And that creates a hesitancy for them to go ahead and participate in the criminal justice system. And it's disheartening a lot of times, because you'll see people that have been abused will unfortunately continue to be abused. And so the criminal justice system is really using the tools that it has available to it to address the problem, whether that's through counseling or whatever it may be. And so from a defense attorney's perspective, because those would be the people across the aisle that I'm dealing with, a lot of times they're either going to present some good story or reasonable story about who the defendant is and why they shouldn't receive a certain type of punishment. But a lot of times we also just see, unfortunately, a lot of sexist and chauvinistic tropes that are just repeated, like the woman is no good. They may not necessarily say that the woman had it coming, but they'll say things like, this person is crazy. You can't trust the way, you can't trust their story. You can't believe them. And so it's really taking a pause and using the science that's in front of us to evaluate how to proceed forward with those cases. And so speaking of family violence cases, a lot of times it's really just taking the time to pause and say, to what extent, based on the tools that I have, can I further protect this victim? And I'll say this and then move on from family violence. Family violence is unique because we are talking, this is my opinion, just based on my experience, we are talking about extremes of society that lead to violence. And so if someone were to say, hey, by showing less preference to the voice of a woman, you lead to violence, people say, well, that's just ridiculous. Or you say, hey, by objectifying women, by being sexist, just in general, by having a society like that, you're going to have extreme factions that then go on and abuse women. People might not want to make the connection between society's treatment of women in general and family violence, but they're absolutely linked, right? And does that mean a sexist person is going to go on and beat their wife or their partner? Absolutely not. But anyone that beats their partner is absolutely a sexist person, is absolutely chauvinist. And so that's a different topic for a different day, but that's kind of a link between societal norms and understandings and how the extreme end of that, the extreme spectrum of that can lead to violence. And so in distinguishing between a victim and a victimizer, oftentimes in family violence, the woman typically is the victim, but there is also evidence that counseling and really an interaction with the criminal justice system can drastically minimize further violence for some people. Now, there's some people that are always going to be abused, and you have to address that, but there is counseling that can affect that. And then more generally speaking, again, this considering societal perspectives, you have to really ask questions, especially when it comes to property crimes, crimes that are involving drugs. What are the societal norms that have led to this crime happening? For example, we at the DA's office definitely have pretrial diversion programs, but another move that recently happened is that any possession of a drug that's less than a gram, at this time, those charges are being rejected. And the reasoning behind that is that you are going to do more harm to an individual in involving them in a criminal justice system for what society deems to be a small or not as significant amount than you would by having them be involved. And I think those are just examples of where people commit crimes, but if there is a rational reason for the crime that you can separate from pure unadulterated evil, then we should take that into account, right? And in a society that really advances and promotes individual responsibility, it's hard to call someone that commits a crime necessarily a victim. I mean, they did commit a crime, but I think there's a scripture in the Bible that says, to him that knows, and I know I'm quoting this incorrectly, but to him that knows, there will be many stripes, and him that doesn't know as much, there will be fewer stripes. I think we do have an obligation and responsibility to take into account all circumstances when we're looking at how to dispense justice.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds a bit like, and I would just agree with this just from my own personal experience in life, but it sounds a bit like the lines of delineation between victim, victimizer, or guilty, not guilty, or just, unjust, in many regards, sometimes aren't as cut and dry as we might want them to be within our legal system. That there are times where, if I hear you correctly in what you're saying, that someone has technically broken the law by the use of illegal drugs, but based on the amount of it, that charge may not be brought to court and they may not be, tried and charged for anything. Technically they broke the law because there's some considerations being given there in regards to is the justice that breaking of the law demands going to outdo or going to actually cause more harm in the long run by putting them through the system, and then they're having to pay for that for years and years to come because it's on their criminal record. And so am I hearing that right? Basically, you're saying we're gonna we're gonna
Right.
essentially turn a blind eye to what this breaking of the law, because to punish them for that is actually going to do them more harm as a citizen. And we're hoping that this is going to lead to some, for a lack of a better word, biblical term, repentance, of changing in their behavior, because the slap on the wrist is actually going to help hopefully curb the behavior rather than punishing them for years and years and years to come. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it also, specifically looking at drugs, it points to a question that we as a society right now are definitely struggling with. And it's become polarized, and it really shouldn't be polarizing. But the question is, what is the purpose of the criminal justice system? And here's like a very simple example, and I don't mean for it to just be too curt or anything or too simplified, but I'm my daughter's parent. It is my job to direct and guide my child to become an adult that contributes as meaningfully as possible and is called by the Lord into whatever field he calls her. But my child is going to do things that I not only disagree with, that are probably wrong and are annoying, and she might repetitively do those things, right? Mm-hmm. And so the question becomes, just because she does something, how severe, and I'm never going to slap my child down on the ground, I'm saying, but how severe would it have to be in order for me to say, oh, I'm just going to backhand this child? Right. And so sometimes you have to say, you know what, I'm going to choose my battles wisely. And I think that's kind of what's been playing out in the criminal justice system and what will continue to play out in the criminal justice system.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I don't know about you. My kids are perfect, man. I don't ever have to discipline my kids. I appreciate that. And then follow-up question for you here. There are people, who would say, and what I'm hearing from what you're saying here is it's a complex situation within our justice system, and a lot of factors and details and things that have to be weighed here and there, and a lot of stuff going on kind of behind the scenes that someone like myself isn't really privy to, because I don't have the education, I don't have the experience. But there are those who would say that our judicial system, our legal system, that there are no systemic problems, that it's just cut and dry, man. If they break the law, they break the law. If they don't break the law, you don't break the law. They would say that there are no systemic problems in our legal system. It sounds to me like, even if you wouldn't call them problems, there's definitely intricacies that make it more complex than most people probably think of it. How would you respond to that frame of thinking, of saying, man, there are no issues, it's cut and dry, it's simple. When it comes to justice, this is what ought to be done?
So I'll say this. I started out in school as an engineering major. Always been extremely good with science and math, and I left engineering just to pursue economics and go on the law. But I've always been a process-oriented person, and so I think that this discussion is another example of something that should not be as polarizing as it is. Mm-hmm. Just from a very commonsensical standpoint. A system, you're essentially saying, is there a process in which a known input can produce an expected outcome? And that's all a system is. Can a known input produce an expected outcome? And the answer is yes, like unequivocally. A known input can produce an expected outcome. And does the science point to instances where race plays a role? Absolutely. Does the science point into that? I think there was a study that came out in Austin that discussed the number of searches of Black drivers compared to white drivers. They showed that yes, Black people and brown people were more likely to be searched, even if no drugs were found. They were just more likely to be searched. It's a known income, known input, color of the driver, expected outcome. They're more likely to be searched. Another example is, of course, I think there was a study that came out maybe a few years ago, recently, that was commissioned by the DA's office, that showed sentences were more likely to be affected by whether or not a defendant had an appointed attorney as opposed to a hired attorney. And so that's something that's involving money. Now, the question after that is, well, what is the response? What is to be done with it as a result of that? But no, systems absolutely exist. And I think that it's unfortunate that not only participants in the criminal justice system, so lawyers, judges, police officers, etc., get really defensive about it. I think it's unfortunate that people either get defensive about it or exploit it in a way that it shouldn't be exploited. Yes, it exists, and the difficult conversation is, how do you address it? Yes, that's the difficult conversation. How do you address it? Yeah. What should be done? But does it exist? For sure. And that's what thing I'm going to say. It's when you have expected outcomes, it's not about whether a person is a good person or not. I mean, I honestly have to check myself a lot of times, because it's good that I'm part of the criminal justice system, but I am not above any of the systemic pressures that come from the criminal. I'm just not. And so I have to be aware of that. I have to be subject to challenge. I have to be subject to critique. But what I can't do is build a wall around me that says I'm not going to hear criticism.
Yeah. I think that the definition you just gave me about a system is incredibly helpful for me. Inputs produce an outcome. And it seems to me, I would respond to if someone said, man, there's no brokenness in our system, there's no issue in our system. I'd say there's always going to be brokenness and issues with any system if people are involved, because we're just broken and fallen people. And if, to take your analogy of if there's information being put in that's going to produce an outcome, if people are involved in the information that's going into that system, and therefore biases and prejudices and things that we may not even be aware of in our own knowledge, as we've been talking about the last few weeks in our class. In other words, it's not just information on, okay, a person broke a law in this way and here's the outcome. It's this specific person who looks like this and comes from this socioeconomic background and talks like this and dresses like this. There's all that extra information that's going into a system based on people's preconceived notions and maybe even unrealized prejudices that can alter the outcome for one person as compared to another person. And so I would from what I hear you saying, I would answer the question by saying, if there's people involved, yes, there's always going to be something broken with the system we have in place. We're doing the best we can, but you can't just look at a system that's run by people and say there's zero issues with the way that system processes information. So, all right, Judge Steve, let me go to you, and then Jaustin, feel free to jump in on this one too. And Judge Steve, if you want to add anything to what Jaustin said, feel free to add that on the front end of your response here. But I want to ask you, we're going to switch gears and go a little bit more the biblical idea of justice and reconciliation. How do you think the Bible define, what would you say is the biblical idea, the biblical definition of justice and reconciliation? And then how do you see that comparing to or contrasting to our legal system's idea of justice and reconciliation?
Right. I will just share briefly in terms of the previous questions, just a couple of thoughts, and that is, it's interesting, like Justin talks about family violence, and I could say that as a judge on the front end of cases, when people first get arrested, that actually can be the most difficult issue that we deal with. I'd tell you that the overwhelming majority, and I'm dealing with the question of how do you distinguish between the victim and the victimizer? And in the overwhelming majority of cases in the criminal justice system, you have some theoretically disinterested witness who's involved. You'll have a police officer that sees a car driving all over the road, drunk and running into telephone poles, or you'll have a cashier at the 7-Eleven saying, yeah, this guy came in and pulled a gun on me and stole something from me. In other words, it's often strangers involved. But in the family violence context, it's often a situation where there's no witnesses. This happens inside of an apartment or a house. There are no other witnesses. And I would say that in probably the majority of cases, the physical evidence and the kind of things that went down, it can make a strong case on who's the victim and who's the victimizer. But then there are some cases where it's just not really clear, and where you get Well, if you talk to each party, it's like you get two totally different universes of what happened. And I liken it to, like, if you're a parent, uh, you have one kid comes to you, you have two kids, and one kid comes to you and says, so and so did such and such to me. And you get angry, right? And you go to that second child and you're like, did you do XYZ? And then you'll find out that technically what the first child said was true. But boy, when you get the whole story, you find out that this fills out the picture in a way that all of a sudden justice doesn't look precisely the way you initially thought when you only heard one side of the story. And the thing is that doesn't change when people get older. I mean, sometimes as people become adults, they become more sophisticated liars or more biased and just given a certain angle. And so it can be challenging on a number of cases trying to figure out who is lying and who's not. And the reason I bring that up is because that the way in which one of the main ways to try to deal with that problem systemically is to make sure people can bond out of jail while their case is pending. Because if they're stuck in jail while their case is pending because they don't have the money to bond out, then they're going to end up getting a court-appointed attorney who, as Justin says, the sentences and how cases are resolved definitely differs with a court-appointed attorney and not by the evidence. But more than that, there is a coercive component that is involved in being in jail while your case is pending. There are a lot of people that they feel like, look, I just want to get out of jail. And in order to have my day in court and fight the case, I got to sit here for a couple of months, if not far longer, before my case goes to trial. And I've lost my job, I'm separated from my family and all those things. And so having a system that somehow enables people to be able, who don't have money, to be able to bond out of jail, and having a system where we kick people out of jail sometimes for free, with necessary preconditions. I mean, sometimes we have to put a GPS monitor on someone's leg to make sure that they don't go near the alleged victim, and so that the cops know where they are at all times. We want to make sure that we're protecting people. But I think that's an example of systemically how the system can benefit. Basically, the system can function in a way that if you've got money, you're just going to get a better outcome in the criminal justice system than if you don't. And that's just not the way it should function. And so issues such as bail reform and making sure that court-appointed attorneys are compensated and have incentive structures that are there to make sure they do the best job possible. I just think that those are important things.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with you on the adults being more sophisticated. What you're describing sounds a lot like the marriage counseling I do.
Yeah, the Bible says in Proverbs that the first to present his case always seems right until someone comes forward and questions him.
Very true.
And that's true in the criminal justice system as well, and so making sure people's right to a fair trial, to give an opportunity for them to give their side of the story. I think that's an important component. And there are systemic things in the system, particularly not having money, that can make that right to a fair trial just look differently.
Yeah, very good. All right, and so as far as the biblical idea of justice and reconciliation and how it compares or contrasts to our legal system, I see a bunch of discrepancies off the top, but I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say that I think normally, at least in the United States and in our Western thinking here, when we think of the term justice, we think in terms of people getting what they deserve. That we think of it in terms of the justice system, in terms of punishment, in terms of what is just and how people are treated, oftentimes in terms of what they did wrong and whether they pay the price for what they did wrong. But justice, and I would also say that the word righteousness, when we think of it in our religious culture, we often think of it in terms of personal morality, in terms of my sexual morality and whether I lie and cheat and things like that. But in the scriptures, I think that the concept of justice and righteousness is just quite a bit different. And if you were to look at the Old Testament, and there's two Hebrew words that are often correlated with justice. One is mishpat and one is zedek. And I won't go into all the details of that. But what really justice is speaking of in the scriptures is not that you get what you deserve in punishment, as much as it is right relationships with other people. not just right relationship with God, but right relations with other people and how I treat other people. And I think you can see that traced in the Old Testament, because one of God's goals when he calls and chooses the nation of Israel is to teach them how to function in a just way as a community. And he instituted certain traditions in the Old Testament law that I think are telling. And one of them, most notably, I think, is the law of gleaning. And in the law of gleaning, it was in the Old Testament where it basically said, if you've got a crop, you cannot harvest your crop all the way to the edges, and you cannot go over the same strip of ground twice to pick up the droppings, but that you were to leave the edges and the droppings, the gleanings, for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the alien. So what was happening there is the law was setting up a structure that even a person's private property rights in their own farm was qualified by a general understanding of their obligation to make sure that those who are in need, the poor, the widow, and the orphan, and the alien, were able to at least get their subsistence needs met. And you see that consistently throughout the Old Testament, where they called this the quartet of vulnerabilities: the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the alien. That God consistently challenges Israel on how they treat those four people and those four groups of folks. And when the prophets come, I think you could sum up the entire book of the prophets in two ways. In two types of sins: idolatry and injustice. Idolatry meaning how do I relate to God, and injustice meaning how do I relate to one another. And I think a good example of this is in Job chapter 31. If you were to read Job chapter 31, verse 16 through 23, Job is talking about the obligation that he feels he has to those who are poor and to those who are marginalized. And he speaks of it in terms that he understands that to not respond to the needs and to not care about those concerns and just to say, that's their life, this is mine, would be an offense to God that God would consider a grievous sin. That's not necessarily how we look at it these days. It oftentimes justice in our Western United States context, we look at justice as being just people getting punished for what they have done, and things of that nature. And so I say that to say that in the famous verse in the Old Testament, Micah 6:8, Micah says, what does God require? He requires that you do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God. To do justice is to care about others the way God would have us to care about others, including in a larger social context. And Jesus doesn't somehow say that, in the New Testament, we just have a different way of looking things and things are going to be much more individualistic. He looks at it quite differently. He basically makes clear that these types of relationships and how we relate to one another is all about what justice is about, so much so that it's intricately intertwined with our relationship with God. So in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, if you are on your way to the altar to go to worship and realize that someone has something against you, that there's something you may have done unfairly to somebody, leave your gift at the altar, go and reconcile with that person, and then come back and offer your gift. In other words, to come to God without taking seriously the breaches and the damage in my relationships with others, he says that's not something that God's just not going to care about. So much so that he says, if you don't forgive others, then God will not forgive you. And I think that Jesus then really pushes this principle heavily in Matthew chapter 25. It's that famous verse where he says, Jesus says, when you were in prison, when I was in prison, you did not visit me. When I was hungry, you did not feed me. When I was naked, you did not clothe me, and so forth. And people said, well, when did we not do that to you? And he says, well, when you didn't do it to the least of my brothers, you didn't do it for me. And when you did it for the least of my brothers, you did it for me. In a sense, he is, I think it's a good argument to make that Matthew 25 is essentially Jesus answering that Old Testament question that Cain asked God. When God came to Cain and said, I hear the blood of your brother Abel crying from the ground, Cain said this, almost in a sarcastic way, perhaps. He says, God says, where is your son, where is your brother Abel? And he says, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? In other words, what does his affairs have to do with me? And the Old Testament Mosaic law and then the New Testament principles that Jesus lays out is basically answering that question, saying, yeah, you are your brother's keeper. You cannot live your life and assume that your personal morality is all that God cares about, that justice is about how we relate to others and in a sense, being concerned about everyone else's needs. That's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. And I would sum it up in this: is we've all heard the term "love your neighbor as yourself" as one of the most important commands. And Jesus sums up these two greatest commandments: love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, the commandment "love your neighbor as yourself" comes from Leviticus 19. The first application from the time that command is handed down is later on in that same chapter. And it says, when you come across a stranger or an alien in your country, do not treat them differently from another. For I am the Lord your God, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. The first application of how to love one's neighbor as himself has to do with someone who is an alien and a stranger, not literally your brother or the person that's living next to you. And so it speaks to what God's perspective of justice looks like, that it's about valuing and caring about my relationships with other people and people's well-being in society. And I say that to say that our current tendency to view justice in terms of punishment and and basically getting what you deserve and what is it that you deserve, rather than about how am I just relating to other people and how am I stewarding my resources and place in society compared to others. By looking at it in the former way, what happens is one could argue we've driven the issue of justice off of the center stage of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. That then when we look at justice in the more narrow way, then issues of justice are just not fundamental to what it means to be a Christian. It may be fundamental to some tangential group of Christians who seem passionate in this area, but it's certainly not an obligation of the church as some kind of a central mission. That social justice is that kind of passion that a few people have. But if we understand justice the way the scriptures talk about justice, then I think it helps us to see that what it means to be a disciple and to be a follower of Christ, that the issue of my relationships with others and issues of justice is right smack in the center of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so I think that there's something about how we have viewed justice in our Western theological landscape that kind of misses that what the scriptures are speaking of when it speaks of justice. Well, that was a long. You asked me something about what the Bible says about something. I can't do that in 1 minute.
Hey, that was well worth the extra time, though. That was worth the price of admission right there. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jaustin. Do you have any thoughts you want to add to that? Or?
I agreed with a lot of what this theologian just said. That was an amazing breakdown, and kind of what came to my mind from a Christian perspective is that as Americans, at least as modern Americans, we've had the privilege of equating our criminal justice system, and also our way of doing things, as lining up with the Lord or lining up with Jesus. And we kind of have symbols that allow us to take some stock on that. We have "In God We Trust" on our coin. We understand that our criminal justice system is absolutely deeply rooted in Judeo-Christian norms. And there are places in the United States where the 10 Commandments are posted on courtrooms, but the criminal justice system is absolutely limited. It is limited. One, it only addresses crimes for which are caught, and it only addresses crimes where there's actually enough evidence to move forward with the crime. But the other end of it is, it doesn't make the victim whole, unfortunately, right? Like if someone robs your house, the likelihood that the person is going to recompense you for the monetary value is low. Not necessarily are you made whole because a person is serving any degree of punishment, whatever the punishment may be. And this is come from a prosecutor's standpoint. This doesn't mean a person doesn't deserve punishment, but that doesn't mean that person, the victim, has been made whole, or their relationship has been made whole. And there are a lot of laws and executions of laws that aren't really centered on making relationships perfect. Anyone that's ever dealt with family law knows that that's just an ugly area of the law where people's worst come out in dealing with some of their most intimate relationships. And so I kind of, to Steve's point, is that we have been very comfortable ceding to our Western norms, or the government, what it means to be a Christian. And sometimes just Western norms can co-opt what it means to be a Christian. And so with the changes that have been happening in society over the last couple of decades, it's kind of been a punch in the mouth to Christianity. It's been disorienting because people have always said, well, whatever America does is a reflection of God's will. And so that can, to a lot of people, seem a tragedy, but to Judge Vigorito's point, it can also be an opportunity to stop and really discern, well, what are the scriptures actually saying on this issue? And have we kind of been lazy in thinking about those issues? I mean, it really hit home with me, and really made me just think about James 4, I believe, and when it discusses what is true religion, and who are the parties that are being taken care of, who are the parties that are being addressed when we're talking about what it really means to follow Christ. Yeah, I mean, those are just my few takeaways from what.
Well, I think both of those, man, just tremendous responses. And we're going to go ahead and get going into our breakout groups. But I just hear what you're saying, Jaustin and Steve, is like there is clearly the biblical concept of justice and reconciliation are primarily relationally focused, secondarily law focused, and the laws are supposed to be put in place to enable the relationships to move forward. And it's like we flip that in our nation, where legal justice and is primarily now legally focused, and maybe not at all relationally focused. And I to Jaustin's point, I think if we can approach the issues of racial injustice and the things that are going on in our nation right now, not primarily as Americans, but as kingdom of God citizens, and say, man, it's okay for us to critique this system. As amazing as a system as we have, and probably one of the best systems that exists on planet Earth, it is still a broken system because broken people are involved in it. And if we can critique the system and ask the question, what does the kingdom of God call us to as followers of Christ on the relational side of pursuing justice for the purpose of relationship, pursuing reconciliation for the purpose of relationship, then I think if we can get that right, eventually it influences and brings adaptations to the legal side as well, rather than flipping that equation and saying if we can get the laws right, then the rest of it will fall in place. So we're going to go into our breakout groups here. Rosalind's going to send us off. Obviously, we're a little short on time, but I hope y'all realize like what y'all just got from these two men ought to set you up for success for your groups later on this week, and just moving on as a follower of Christ. That I'm going to go back and listen to this video multiple times because that was just so incredibly helpful and insightful. Thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom.